Hello and welcome to Fit After 40. Our guest today is Dr. Anne Wynn. Dr. Wynn is an associate professor in the Department of Endocrinology at the University of Tennessee Health Science Center, as well as a practicing endocrinologist. And today I've got some questions about metabolic syndrome and sugar and all that good stuff. Dr. Wynn, thanks for taking the time to talk with us.
Yeah, happy to be here.
So jumping right in, obviously we know that eating too much sugar leads to weight gain, but weight gain is not the only symptom of metabolic syndrome. Can we talk about some of the metabolic damage that is done by consuming too much simple carb?
Sure. So to start with a definition of terms, the metabolic syndrome is sort of a cluster of problems that we see that tend to be associated with overweight and obesity. But we would usually define that as having at least 3 out of 5 factors, including abdominal obesity, elevated blood pressure, elevated triglycerides, impaired fasting glucose or impaired glucose tolerance, and low HDL. So having at least 3 out of 5 of those, we would say that person has metabolic syndrome. And we know that metabolic syndrome significantly increases your risk of cardiovascular disease, so heart attack and stroke. Where does it come from? We think that insulin resistance is a root cause for several of these issues. And some of that can come from overconsumption of sugars. There's usually a genetic component to that as well, at least with the development of full-blown diabetes. But even people without diabetes or people without obesity will have some degree of insulin resistance that's increased by consuming sugars, especially fructose. So your typical table sugar is made up of a glucose and a fructose molecule. That's sucrose when they put the two together. And your body is pretty good at handling glucose and keeping it in very tight parameters in your bloodstream. But fructose can be a little bit more of a challenge. So excess fructose consumption will lead to accumulation of sugars in the liver. It shifts your metabolism over toward lipids rather than glucose. And will promote insulin resistance. And so that's some of the problems that we see when we are over consuming fructose containing foods.
And is fructose the sugar that is found in fruit? Is that correct?
Yes, so it's naturally occurring in fruit as well as many other plant sources. We've all probably heard about we shouldn't be eating as much high fructose corn syrup. So
Of
that would
course.
be a product derived from corn that's enhanced with additional fructose to make it taste sweeter. Like everything else, there's pros and cons to the quality of the research, but I think overall most people would agree that it's generally not great for you.
Sure. But there is a big difference between eating foods that have refined fructose added and then eating fruit. What is the difference there? Why is it the whole food is healthy for you when fructose is so bad?
So some of it's just going to come down to quantity and also to the other elements in those foods. So if you subsisted on a diet of entirely fruit and nothing else, you probably would still see some issues from consuming that much fructose, even from a whole fruit or natural source. But when you eat the whole fruit compared with added sugars that have been added to processed foods, you're getting fiber, which is going to slow down your absorption of those simple carbohydrates. And then all of the other benefits that you get from fruits, vitamins, phytochemicals, other things that can be reducing inflammation in general. So there's a whole host of other benefits you get from the whole food, but probably the biggest one would be the presence of that fiber in the intact fruit is helping you sort of process that sugar content better. And then in general, you're just going to be eating less of it. So one glass of orange juice takes, 6 to 8 oranges to make, and how many people are going to sit down and eat 6 whole oranges at one sitting?
It's a lot of
Versus
oranges.
you can drink that glass of juice in 5 minutes. So
Right.
there's definitely a quantity difference.
So would you characterize fruit juice as being, I mean, is it really just like drinking soda with vitamin C in it? Is it that bad?
It can depend on how it's processed and handled. Most of the things that you're going to buy that are shelf stable at the grocery store, even if it's 100% fruit juice, it's still not going to be my first choice for people to drink.
Okay.
Now, more than half my practice is diabetes. And so I am going to
Sure.
have a little bit of a skewed perspective on that because I have to spend a lot of time telling people that unfortunately your body doesn't care that you switched from, Mountain Dew to orange juice. The sugar is
Right.
still sugar and it's still going to make your blood sugar spike. So.
And this leads to a lot of inflammation. You've mentioned that. Can you talk a little more about the inflammation? A lot of our listeners are athletes, and that is a consideration for them.
Sure. So there is some evidence that you can have a higher inflammatory effect, especially when you're comparing fructose or high fructose corn syrup compared to the sucrose, like the whole molecule or glucose alone. I think in terms of giving you an exact quantifiable measurement of how much inflammation is happening with that is difficult. But certainly we do have some evidence that it is increasing inflammation. Both in animal and human studies.
And spiking the blood sugar, why is spiking blood sugar problematic?
So some of that depends on the person. Someone with fully normal glucose tolerance, so that's kind of a medical term we use to talk about how your body processes glucose. They will not have prolonged spikes in blood sugar when they're eating. So somebody who's completely non-diabetic, pre-diabetic, none of that, may be able to eat a bowl of ice cream and their blood sugar will spike after about 30 minutes and it'll be back down to normal within an hour. Okay. And so for many people, you are going to have less of an impact. What we see when people have what we would call impaired glucose tolerance, meaning those spikes are higher, persist for longer. Basically, your body is not processing and getting that sugar out of the bloodstream quickly. That is when we start to see that whole host of inflammatory effects. So your body is not, your blood vessels are not designed to have high levels of sugar for long periods of time. And when that happens and they're exposed to those high sugar levels over time, you get a buildup of what we would call advanced glycosylation end products.
Okay.
So kind of oxidized, partly broken down sugars that have just stuck onto a bunch of stuff they're not supposed to be on. Okay. Your body knows that they're not supposed to be there. And so that triggers the inflammatory cascade to try to remove
immune response.
Those damaged, an immune response, inflammation to try to remove those damaged blood vessel walls and blood cells and all of these other things. And so that's where we see the risk of heart disease and stroke go up for people with prediabetes and diabetes because they're just getting this ongoing damage to their blood vessels due to that buildup and inflammation.
So when we're talking about these metabolic symptoms, and obviously they go hand in hand with obesity, you can't really separate them, but with a lot of drugs like Ozempic and so forth, we kind of are seeing we are seeing people who are able to remain thin, and they think that gives them a license to eat whatever they want. But these metabolic symptoms are not necessarily contingent on obesity, right? I mean, we can still see a lot of these complications, even if you have a BMI of 24 or 25.
Right. So this would all be compounded and worsened by obesity because we know now that obesity or especially visceral adipose tissue or the fat that's around your organs, your internal organs, is metabolically active and it does lead to more inflammatory response. And so that's not just neutral tissue, it's actually doing damage when it's there. But even at a normal weight, you can still see these effects in the liver, the increased insulin resistance, and, again, the just overall detrimental effects of frequent and prolonged spikes in blood sugar. So no, you should not just go eat whatever you want. The other problem is when you're eating foods that are what we would say are not nutrient dense, so a low nutrient density, meaning they have a high amount of calories, but not a lot of nutritional things that your body actually needs to function. So if you're staying at a normal weight, but you're eating a lot of sugar and processed foods, you're replacing nutritious food in your diet. And so you're not giving your body what you need. You're giving your body things that are just not really serving you. So if you're eating a lot of highly processed foods, you're not eating those whole foods that contain your vitamins and minerals and all of those other beneficial anthocyanins and phytochemicals and things like that. And then finally, you are going to see, especially with medications like Ozempic, which is the probably most popular example of a class of medicines called the GLP-1 agonists or glucagon-like peptide 1 agonists, is muscle mass loss. So that's actually a
Oh, wow.
significant problem that we see when people are having substantial weight loss. If they are not doing lifestyle changes alongside, they're losing muscle along with fat. You're always going to lose a little bit of muscle with a significant weight loss, but it's exaggerated with the rapid weight loss that we're seeing with these medications. And so we'll counsel patients to try to start an exercise program, including strength training. We will try to get people doing higher protein diets. But if you're just reducing your calorie intake and you're not paying attention to the nutrient composition, yes, you're going to have a lot of long-term detrimental effects in terms of body composition, as well as the inflammatory issues we've already discussed.
Is that loss of muscle mass? Now, of course, calories are burned in muscles predominantly, and therefore, if you lose muscle mass, you're going to naturally burn fewer calories. Is that one of the factors that leads to people plateauing in their weight loss journey before they've reached their target weight? Is that something people need to be mindful of?
It certainly can, and it can also lead to weight regain down the road. So your metabolism decreases, smaller bodies need less energy. And really the only way we know of to maintain or to prevent some of that decrease in metabolism is to increase your muscle mass and your body composition. And so that is, that's a marker for long-term success. When we look at people who have managed to lose substantial amounts of weight and keep it off, virtually all of them are doing regular exercise. And that is just something that is typically going to be needed to offset that drop in metabolism.
You know, when we look back at advances that have led to really great gains in longevity, you know, we can talk about things like vaccines, but in the modern era, one of the biggest factors between our generation and our grandparents is probably smoking cessation. And I have heard metabolic health put in that same box, that maintaining a healthy body weight is akin to smoke. Would you say it's that dramatic?
Yeah, absolutely. And as far as I'm aware, obesity related deaths have actually overtaken smoking related deaths as a leading cause of sort of lifestyle related mortality. So this is definitely, I mean, you know, we have an obesity epidemic. I don't have the facts and figures in front of me, but absolutely there's been a meteoric rise in the rates of overweight and obesity since the 1970s and 80s. And no one's really sure why. It's probably multiple factors, but certainly the increase in highly processed foods, sugar sweetened beverages plays a significant role in that rise. And absolutely, it's a very basically overtaking as a leading cause of death.
Wow. You know, most of us have a bathroom scale. We know what we weigh. And a significant percentage of people also monitor their blood pressure at home. I certainly do. Is blood glucose something that we should take a look at home outside of just the doctor's office?
So this is an interesting question to ask this summer, because the first over-the-counter continuous glucose monitors are coming available this year. I'm not sure if you are aware of that. I have a little bit of mixed feelings about using those for people without diabetes, because I think I actually looked into this for a friend who was wearing a sample. This person had a strong family history of diabetes, but was not pre-diabetic or diabetic. And so I was looking into kind of what basis we have of knowing what are the normal glucose response to food in healthy people, how high can it get, how long can it be, I'm a little concerned about it producing more anxiety than help in some people. However, I think certainly if you are in that position where you've been told you were pre-diabetic, or maybe you have a parent or both parents certainly with type 2 diabetes, it's not unreasonable to look at that. But do I think that the average person needs to be wearing a continuous glucose monitor or checking their glucose at home on a regular basis? No, I don't think that's something people need to do around the clock. But I am bracing myself for a wave of people who have
Hmm.
bought a Dexcom or Libre over the counter
Sure.
and want to know if it's okay that their blood sugar took 45 minutes to come down after a meal instead of 30.
Okay.
Uh,
Sure. Sure.
yeah,
So
yeah. So they'll,
contextualizing these results is important.
yes, it depends on sort of how the person is going to use it and
Hmm.
yeah, all that. Another thing to know about those devices is they are not 100% accurate. So there's
Sure.
factors that can throw them off. And they are a little bit less accurate at the lower glucose ranges for some of
Okay.
the models. I haven't looked at they haven't released trial results for the particular models that they're putting out over the counter. But generally, there's going to be a difference of around 5 to 10% compared with a gold standard. So I will also say, if you do choose to get one of those devices, please don't read too much into exact
Sure.
specific numbers on it. So,
As with anything, you want to confirm weird readings with your doctor.
yes. Yeah.
So when we do go to the doctor's office and we do get that metabolic panel, there's a whole list of numbers on there, and glucose is among them. What do these numbers mean? What is a good glucose number, for example?
Yeah, so some of that will depend on whether you're fasting or non-fasting. So
Sure.
a normal fasting glucose, so a fasting glucose over 125, so 126 or higher is going to be diagnostic of diabetes, actually.
Okay, that is
100,
diabetes.
yeah, we would say you have diabetes. Now, again, we are typically not going to diagnose diabetes based on one single lab test.
Sure.
But if you are truly fasting for at least 8 to 10 hours, under 100 would be normal. 100 to 125 would be considered pre-diabetes or impaired fasting glucose. Those
Okay.
terms could be used a little interchangeably. And then 126 or higher would be diabetes. Yeah.
Okay. So and anything below 70 would also indicate a problem, correct?
Not necessarily for a healthy non-diabetic person.
Okay.
So
Okay.
the low cutoff of 70 is really meant for people with diabetes.
I see.
For example, and it's also normed to men and not women. So that's an interesting little sideline that we could get
Okay.
into of how a lot of physiologic parameters were set based on white male medical students in the early 1900s. So if you're not a white male medical student from 1920s, some of those might be a little off for you. Women specifically can have
Sure.
blood sugars in the 60s, and that can be normal if you're not symptomatic.
Feels good to know the world was built for me. Um, so,
Absolutely.
and when it comes to cholesterol, what numbers would you be looking at for cholesterol?
So, in your general cholesterol panel, you're going to get a total cholesterol, which is just what it sounds like, all of the cholesterol.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're going to have your LDL cholesterol, which is the low density lipoprotein. We would typically call that the bad cholesterol. So that's
Right.
the cholesterol that carries fats from your liver into your body. Then your HDL or high density lipoprotein is what we would call your good cholesterol. And so that's carrying fats back from your system into your liver to be processed and broken down.
Okay.
And so in general, you want to have a lower LDL, higher
Right.
HDL, and then your overall total cholesterol, you want to be under 200.
Okay.
LDL, you want to be under 100, and then HDL 60 or higher would be considered good
Sure.
numbers. And then you'll also get a number for triglycerides, which
Okay.
is a different type of lipid that we can measure in the bloodstream. That is very affected by diet and what you're eating. And it plays a role in heart disease. Again, we don't have 100% clarity in
Sure.
the medical literature as to how strong of a role that is or what we can do to modify that aside from eating a healthy diet and exercising. But extremely high triglycerides, which would usually have a genetic cause, can lead to pancreatitis and other issues. So certainly if the triglycerides are over 500, we get pretty worried.
And lately I've been reading that the link between dietary cholesterol and metabolic panel cholesterol is not as direct as was once thought. Eating eggs may not spike your LDL cholesterol. Can you talk a little bit about that as far as what we
Yeah,
consume?
so for most people, their diet does have an impact on cholesterol. But for many people, especially with extremely high cholesterol, there is going to be a genetic component to that. And so certainly, to say, yeah, 100% of people with high cholesterol could go on a vegan diet and it would fix the issue,
Okay.
is not true.
Okay.
Eggs are one of the favorites. We switch back and forth roughly every decade
Mhm.
on whether they're good for you or bad for you. I think this decade they're good for you.
Right.
Um, and nutritional research in general is hard to interpret because a lot of the studies rely on self-reporting of dietary intake.
Sure.
And
Very
if you've spent a
unreliable.
lot of time with patients reporting their own dietary intake to you, you get a little suspicious of some of those numbers.
Of course.
Uh, but overall, yes, your diet does play an impact. But for
Mhm.
many people, especially at the extremes of high cholesterol, it is more genetically influenced, and so we're frequently going to need medication to treat it if it's extremely high.
And when it comes to the levers we have to control this, obviously we've talked a lot and everybody knows, eat plants, eat lean proteins, exercise, but what levers do we have to kind of influence our metabolic health outside of just the basics?
So we actually have quite a lot of information about the effect of sleep on
Okay.
your metabolic health and endocrine health. I actually was just listening to a podcast on the way home that was going over the results of a paper where they took one single night of restricted sleep, where they restricted sleep by to 4 hours rather than, in people who usually slept 8 hours a night. And even after a single night, they saw some indications of higher insulin resistance
Wow,
and
one
of
night.
some alterations in mitochondrial function based on just one night. And then that's obviously far more exaggerated in people who are chronically sleep deprived.
Sure.
The amount of sleep that's right for you is different for different people, but
Mhm.
there are a lot fewer people who can function on less than 6 hours of sleep than think they can.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah.
most people who think they're okay on 4 to 5 hours a night really are not okay on 4 to 5 hours a night.
Sure,
So, in
sure.
general, we'll kind of throw around 6 to 9 hours as a
Mhm.
range for healthy adults. But your exact number that's right for you, you kind of want to make based on how you're feeling after an adequate night's
Right.
sleep. But certainly, we see higher risk of obesity, metabolic syndrome, diabetes in people who do not have good
Mhm.
quality sleep and good sleep duration. As well, your sort of bad habits that, again, we probably all know we're not supposed to be doing.
Sure.
So, smoking, huge
Yeah.
impact on your cardiovascular health. It
Screws
gets a
up
lot of
everything.
press for lung cancer, but
Mhm.
it's really, really bad for heart disease and peripheral vascular disease as well. So if you ever ask a cardiologist about tobacco, they'll
Sure.
spit on the ground to ward off the evil. um,
Right.
it's really really hard on your vascular system as well. And
Absolutely.
then alcohol in
Mhm.
excess, is also going to have a lot of detrimental effects. And then with exercise, of course, again, we know we should be exercising, but even just the amount of time you spend sedentary has a correlation
Right.
to increased risk of metabolic syndrome. So
Sure.
not only should you be doing purposeful exercise, but you should also be limiting how much time you're sitting
Right.
throughout your day. And, again, exact numbers on that are going to vary based
Right.
on what you're looking at, but move around some
Absolutely.
is good
Absolutely.
advice.
So, Dr. Wynn, one on smoking cessation, one bright point there is that after you quit smoking, the risk of heart disease returns to normal a lot more quickly than some other complications from smoking. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly see a significant impact with smoking cessation that is helpful for reducing the inflammation leading to that risk.
Yeah, absolutely. So, if you're a smoker, there's never a bad time to quit. So,
Yes, absolutely.
and then what else? What else can we do to help kind of influence these numbers? Get a good night's sleep. Make sure you're getting up and walk around the office every hour or so. What other things can we do?
So we want to reduce stress. Um, there is a lot of medical literature around stress and the impact on heart disease that certainly increases your risk. And having healthy relationships and a sense of community is actually protective against a lot of medical issues. So people who identify or feel that they are socially isolated or lonely have a higher risk of heart disease and stroke,
Wow.
probably also increasing risk of dementia and just general mortality. So
That's
those are some other things we can do to maintain a healthy life.
yeah. And it's interesting. That's one of the adverse has been observed in the blue zones. I don't know if you've read the book by Dan Buettner, but the areas he has identified where people live these unusual lifespans are marked by very close knit communities. People tend to live in these very close communities, and that does seem to have a health benefit. So maybe you could suggest, I have a sweet tooth. A lot of people do. What can we shift to that maybe would be a healthier choice while still maybe scratching that itch a little bit?
Yeah, so we talked about how whole fruits are better than, processed foods with added sugar or than fruit juices. So that's certainly a great choice, probably the most natural way to satisfy a sweet tooth. Um, Artificial sweeteners are controversial, so there's going to be a lot of pros
Yep.
and cons if you're looking around. People are going to say it's going to give you cancer and all of this. Um,
Mhm.
it, that may be true. Again, when we look at this research, it can be hard to separate out added sugars versus other dietary choices that may go along with
Right.
that. Um, but we do seem to see, at least when you take them as a broad whole, there's probably an increase in cancer and heart disease risk with high consumption. That's another thing to know is when you're giving these studies, they're usually looking at sort of this highest quartile or quintile, meaning people who are in the top 20 or 25% of consuming
Sure.
these artificial sweeteners are where we're seeing these impacts. So as I tell my patients, try to keep it to 1 to 2 servings a day. Don't drink a 12 pack of
Right.
Diet Coke every day.
Right.
Um,
Right. So if you're going to have a Diet Coke, have one, don't have 10.
yes. And then there are some smaller studies with honey or stevia that suggest that these may address, well, honey, of course, does have
Yep.
sugar in it, but probably has a lower glycemic index and some additional health benefits with it. And then stevia seems to avoid some of the health risk with other artificial sweeteners. But I wouldn't say that we have conclusive information on that. It hasn't been around as long.
Okay. So moderation is usually good advice. When in doubt,
When in doubt,
moderation is usually a good
moderation.
way to go.
Yes, I will usually tell people try to shoot for, depending on your goals, 80 to 90% of your diet, eat the things you should eat that are healthy for your body. And 10 to 20% of the time, give yourself a break.
Sure. Sure. Well, great. Well, I'm kind of growing mindful of your time. I know you're on a tight timetable today, but is there anything else that you'd like to share? Anything else that people should be cognizant of or aware of before we go?
So overall, I would say this is easier said than done. If you look at the
Sure.
recommendations for added sugar, and if you're someone who tracks what you eat, most guidelines, most health organizations are going to recommend somewhere between 5 to 10% of your calories coming from added sugars, which is now listed
Okay.
separately on nutrition labels in the US. And depending
Right.
on what your calorie intake is, that may be as little as 15 to 30 grams of added sugar per day. Um, if you start really looking at that on nutrition labels, you're going to hit that number pretty fast. Some of that is going to be really do the best you can, think
Sure.
about your whole lifestyle and making improvements in all of these other parameters, and thinking about your individual health risks based on
Absolutely.
information from your doctor or your family history. Um, but overall, we're sort of all doing our best.
So, but in terms of servings that we're accustomed to, that means that one large Coca-Cola may exceed the recommended allowance of sugars for most people.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So
So,
sugar has 4 calories per gram. So if you're looking at our stereotypical 2000 calorie diet, that means you want 200 or fewer calories to come from added sugars. And that's going to break down to be about 50 grams or less. And so one Coca-Cola can, 12-ounce can, not the bottles, has 40 grams
Right.
of sugar. And so, yeah, you're
Wow.
already there or over, depending
You're
on
there.
your calorie intake or what you're looking at. So if I had one message, it would be they need to put warning labels on sugar sweetened beverages like they do on cigarettes. They
Like
should
they do
have
with
to put the
tobacco,
skull and
because it's,
crossbones on your package of soda.
yeah. Well, until we get there, hopefully we could just convince our listeners to pay attention to the labels and add that skull and crossbones mentally. But thank you so much for your time, and thank you for the information. This has been really helpful, and it's a real pleasure. Like Tony always says, podcasts are a great way to get interesting people to talk to you. So we really appreciate it.
Absolutely. It's been great. Thank you.